This is the analysis of history by John Burnside, part 2. So, we've got to this section where he has started to think about the transience of life, the intangibility of the things we see around us. And he ends this section with a really quite beautiful description of delicate things in nature, with the aim of showing us how fragile nature is. And it's easy, I think, for the reader to get lost in that. And here we get this line break, and he doesn't let us luxuriate in that beautiful description, because he suddenly moves on and says sometimes. So we've got another temporal marker. So we've gone from today, at times, to sometimes. Time is getting more vague. But notice that sometimes suggests plural, doesn't it, rather than today. So he's moving now out of the present moment and thinking about things that happen a lot. Sometimes I am dizzy with the fear of losing everything. And that's really brutal, it's really emotive, isn't it? That, wait a minute, let's stop thinking about how pretty, newborn babies and sea anemones are. Let's think about how the planet could be dying. And then he does this asyndetic list. So that's a list which is broken up by commas rather than conjunctions. So the sea, the sky, all living creatures, forests, estuaries. And to me, asyndetic listing suggests pace, and it's quite a frantic way of listing things rather than with conjunctions. So there's an urgency. He needs to tell you all the things he's worried that we might lose. We trade so much to know the virtual, we spend so much thinking about abstract things, and we scarcely register the drift and tug of other bodies. So there's an irony there almost, isn't there? Because isn't that what poetry is? Often musing on the virtual, the things that we can't see. And he's saying we need to think more about the physical world. I love the ambiguity of other bodies, because he could mean literally a physical relationship with someone, but does he mean the movement of planetary bodies? So there's a beautiful ambiguity to that expression. But his point is that we need to think about what is happening in the literal world. And I love the way he shifts, between today and repeated occasions, but he wants us to do something about it now. It's really clever. What he does now is he starts to use extended metaphors of fish, which I know sounds a bit strange and unromantic, to illustrate the idea of being in this transitive state. He wants us to think about how we and the planet are in a transitive state, and we need to do something to protect ourselves and the planet now. And of course, in the background, the events of 9/11 are all unfolding as he writes this. And of course, you're too young to remember, but there was a real sense of fear around those events. Every time you turned on the news, there seemed to be another attack happening. There was a real fear that it might happen again, and a real sense that the whole world that we lived in, which felt very, very safe, had completely changed. So this sense of transitive state is about the planet, people, and also 9/11. Now let's have a look about what he says about these fish. The quiet local forms of history. So he's telling you, I'm going to give you this specific metaphor of fish. The fish lodged in the tide beyond the sands. So some fish get stuck when the tide goes out. So this is a sense of some people are stuck. And it's important to not be, to recognise that you're in a transitive state or a liminal space. And that you might need to move yourself on to the next phase of your life or existence. And let's remember that this is an extended metaphor of fish. And this is such a beautiful image, I think. The long insomnia of ornamental carp in public parks, captive and bright and hung in their own slow-burning, transitive gold. Now, I'll just unpick this image a little bit for you. I don't know if you're familiar with koi carp, but they are incredibly beautiful fish, and they grow to a huge size. You may have seen them in a garden centre or in a pond somewhere. And the reason that they grow to a huge size is that they live really, really a long time. A couple of 100 years, some of them. So there are fish in your local garden centre that will outlive you, that will outlive your grandparents. And as they grow bigger and they live a long time, the colour that they are changes. So you might see fish that are very pale in colour, some that are orange, some that are dark red, and that's because the colour of their scales changes over time. And he talks about them having a long insomnia. So insomnia is when you can't sleep. And, it is a legend that fish never sleep. I believe they do. I'm not an expert on such matters, but it looks like they never sleep. So he notes that the fish seem to be constantly alert and constantly observing us, almost as if they're a superior species. So I think it's almost like a warning not to be arrogant as a human being, that don't get stuck. Remember that there are other forms of nature that will outlive us, and that everything, we and the fish, are in a transitive state. And he carries that on here by talking about jam jars of spawn and sticklebacks or goldfish carried home. Now here he's referring to something like frog spawn. I don't know if you ever collected that when you were little, but the reason often that parents get children to collect frog spawn from a pond and take it home is that what's fascinating is the transition that they then see from frog spawn to a tadpole to a frog. And sticklebacks and goldfish, again, are little fish that children would catch in a river or win at the fair. And these are all creatures that are in a transitive state. And he's asking us as well, of course, to think about our impact on the planet by talking about fish that we tend to catch, as human beings. And it's a fascinating set of images, extended metaphor, that really makes you think about what is tangible or intangible. And the goldfish carried home from fairgrounds to the hum of the radio, I think makes you think of another popular image, because goldfish aren't meant to listen to radios, are they? They're meant to be wild animals. It makes you think of that old saying of fish out of water. So it's a warning, it's amusing on the idea that at times we will all feel like that. We'll all feel like we're on our own trying to work things out. And these fish are literally caught between states, which is how he feels at this point. He knows that the world around him is changing. He's got his little boy in front of him, like literally growing up minute by minute. He can see evidence in the nature around him that the world is changing, and then he's got these warplanes flying overhead that suggest that politically the world is changing. And then we get this next kind of section, this break, the final one. But this is the problem. And notice this caesura here, this really firm line break with the colon, which emphasises, right, I'm going to tell you now what the problem is. How to be alive in all this gazed upon and cherished world, but do no harm. So how can we coexist with nature, and how can we make our mark upon the world but without harming it? Gazed upon suggests that we, I think, consider nature to be there for our benefit, for something lovely for us. We forget that it's a system, that exists or should exist independently of us. And although we cherish the world, we sometimes do it harm. So that is, to him, all of the things that are happening around him are evidence that that is the problem, that it's very difficult for humans to exist in a world without doing any harm. And of course that links to the title of History, the idea of what legacy are we creating, what are we leaving behind physically and spiritually. And then of course he cleverly moves this idea onto children again. What legacy are we leaving for our children? A toddler on a beach sifting wood and dried weed from the sand and puzzled by the pattern on a shell. His parents on the dune slacks with a kite plugged into the sky, all nerve and line. So the child is trying to make sense of what he can see, and the parents are watching him, and the fact that they're kind of plugged into the sky suggests that they're firmly attached to what they already know. They're trying to interpret the world in a way that they already know, and that's making them anxious. They are all nerve and line. And that makes them sound like fishermen, doesn't it? There's a metaphor there. There's an idea that they are continuing to fly a kite, or they're continuing to cast out a fishing line in the hope of exploring or finding something new. But they're also watching their child anxiously, knowing that he is growing up. and that, you know, new things are good, but they're seeking for the familiar because they're plugged in, and they're afraid of everything changing and wanting it to stay the same. Parents afraid, but still through everything attentive to the irredeemable. And the final line there of the poem is really quite dark, in that it suggests that everybody realises in the end that they cannot save themselves and they cannot save their child from things that can't be changed. So they can't change the inevitable. If I write that there. So they can't save their child from the horror of war, they can't save their child from illness, they can't save the planet from damage, and they can't do anything to stop time or death. And Burnside is politically active, and he campaigns often for issues around ecology, and you can see how important it is to him, this saving of the planet. And I think when you start this poem, you immediately see that date and think, well, it must be about 9/11. And as you go through the poem, you can see that that's just one facet, one aspect of the poem that adds in to this other message of, you know, there's nothing we can do to stop time moving on, so we ought to be considerate in the time that we have, because even some, you know, beautiful fish will outlive us. We are very, very small in the scheme of things.